You stand waist-deep in freezing water. The cold has stopped hurting. Now your legs are just numb. You cannot feel your feet anymore. You have been standing here for 6 hours and you have at least 6 more to go. Your hands are raw and bleeding from handling rough rope and sharp hooks. Your back screams from bending over constantly. The smell is overwhelming. Dead fish, rotting bait, salt water mixed with blood. You are exhausted. You are starving, but you cannot stop. If you stop, you do not get paid. And if you do not get paid, your children do not eat tonight. So you reach into the icy water again. You grab another oyster. You pry it open with a knife that has already cut your fingers twice today. You scrape out the contents. You toss the shell aside. And you reach for another. This is not a punishment. This is not a crime. This is your job. And this is what survival cost in the past. This was the brutal reality in Britain and America during the 18 and early 1900s, a time when industrial growth created enormous demand for raw materials but offered workers almost nothing in return. Coastal communities depended on fishing, shellfish harvesting, and processing to survive. Oysters were particularly valuable. They were a cheap source of protein for the working poor and a delicacy for the wealthy. Demand was constant. But harvesting oysters was backbreaking, dangerous, and paid almost nothing. Workers, often entire families including women and children, stood in tidal waters for 12 to 16 hours a day, prying open oysters with knives, extracting the meat, and filling baskets that weighed more than they did. They worked in all weather, in freezing winter cold, in summer heat, through storms. The work destroyed hands, backs, and lungs. But for people living on the edge of starvation, it was one of the few jobs available. You did not need skills. You did not need tools. You just needed a willingness to stand in cold water all day and destroy your body for a handful of coins. Her name was Sarah. She was 24 years old when she started working as an oyster shucker. She lived in a small fishing village on the coast of Maryland with her husband, 2 young children, and her aging mother. Her husband worked on a fishing boat, but the pay was irregular and barely enough. When the oyster company opened a processing station near the docks and started hiring, Sarah applied. She was told to report at dawn. No training was provided. She was handed a short, blunt knife and shown to a section of the tidal flat where oysters were piled. Her job was simple. Stand in the water, pick up oysters, open them with the knife, scrape the meat into a basket, repeat. She would be paid by the basket. The faster she worked, the more she earned. Sarah asked how long she would be working each day. The foreman laughed and said until the oysters were done or until she collapsed. Whichever came first. Sarah's first day was agony. She waded into the water at sunrise. Within minutes her feet were numb from the cold. She picked up her first oyster. It was covered in barnacles and sharp edges that cut her hands. She wedged the knife into the hinge and pried. The shell resisted. She pushed harder. The knife slipped and sliced across her palm. Blood ran down her wrist. She wrapped it in a rag and kept working. She had no choice. By midday, her back was screaming. Her hands were covered in cuts. Her arms ached from the repetitive motion, but she kept going. She worked until sunset, 12 hours straight, standing in cold water, bending, prying, scraping. At the end of the day, she had filled 3 baskets. The foreman paid her a few cents per basket. It was barely enough to buy bread and milk. Sarah went home exhausted, her hands too swollen to hold her children, but she was back in the water the next morning. The work became routine. Sarah stood in the water every day, sun or rain, warm or freezing. She learned to work faster, to position the knife so it did not slip as often, but the damage accumulated. Her hands became a mass of scars and calluses. Her fingers started to curl from repetitive strain. She developed chronic pain in her wrists and shoulders. Her back bent forward permanently from the constant hunching. She coughed frequently from breathing in salt spray and shell dust. Her legs were covered in sores from standing in contaminated water. But she kept working because her family depended on those few cents she earned. Her husband's fishing income was not enough. Her children were growing and needed food. Her mother was too old to work. Sarah was the only one who could bring in steady money, however little it was. Sarah stopped being able to enjoy anything. She woke in pain. She worked in pain. She went to bed in pain. Her entire existence revolved around oysters. She dreamed about them. She saw them when she closed her eyes. Her hands moved in prying motions even when she was trying to rest. She became mechanical, emotionless, just going through the motions of survival. She stopped playing with her children because she was too exhausted. She stopped talking to her husband about anything except money and food. She stopped attending church because she was too ashamed of her ruined hands and bent posture. She felt herself disappearing piece by piece, swallowed by the endless cycle of standing in cold water and opening shells. The other women working beside her were in the same condition. They stood in rows, silent, bent over, their hands moving constantly. No one had energy for conversation. No one had anything to say. They were all just trying to survive one more day. Sarah saw women collapse from exhaustion. She saw children as young as 8 working alongside their mothers, their small hands already scarred and bleeding. She saw elderly women who could barely stand still forcing themselves into the water because they had no other way to eat. This was not life. This was slow death disguised as employment. Think about this. Imagine working 12 hours a day in freezing water, destroying your body bit by bit, for wages that barely keep you alive. Imagine having no other choice. Imagine watching your children go through the same thing because the cycle never ends. Could you do it? And what does it say about a system that forces people into this position just to survive? The dangers were constant. The water was contaminated with sewage, industrial waste, and bacteria. Open cuts and sores became infected easily. Sarah developed infections in her hands multiple times. They would swell, turn red, and ooze pus. She had no money for a doctor. She just soaked them in salt water and hoped they would heal. Some did. Some did not. She watched a woman lose 2 fingers to infection. The woman kept working with her remaining fingers because stopping meant starvation. Oyster shells themselves were dangerous. The sharp edges could cut deep. Sarah saw a woman slice open her wrist when a shell broke unexpectedly. Blood poured into the water. The woman tried to stop the bleeding with rags, but it would not stop. She was carried away, pale and shaking. Sarah heard later that she had died. The company replaced her the next day. Weather was another enemy. In winter, the water was so cold that workers developed frostbite. Sarah lost feeling in her toes one winter. They turned black. She thought she might lose them, but eventually sensation returned, though the pain was worse than the numbness. In summer, the sun beat down relentlessly. There was no shade in the tidal flats. Workers became dehydrated, dizzy, and sick from heat exposure. Some collapsed face first into the water and drowned before anyone could reach them. And through all of this, the work continued. Bodies were removed. New workers were hired. The oysters kept coming. But here is the darkest truth. The companies that hired oyster shuckers deliberately kept wages low to maintain a desperate workforce. If they paid too much, workers might save money and leave. But by paying just barely enough to survive, they ensured workers could never escape. It was economic slavery. Workers were technically free, but they were trapped by debt, poverty, and lack of alternatives. The companies knew exactly what they were doing. They calculated the minimum amount needed to keep people alive and working, and they paid exactly that. Not a penny more. Now think about this. Right now, in this moment, millions of people around the world are working in similar conditions, trapped in jobs that destroy their bodies for wages that barely cover survival. They work in factories, fields, and fisheries, unable to escape because the system is designed to keep them there. Has anything really changed? Or have we just moved the suffering to places where we do not have to see it? Most oyster shuckers lasted only 5 to 10 years before their bodies gave out completely. Sarah lasted 7 years. By the time she was 31, she was broken. Her hands were so damaged she could barely hold a knife. Her back was bent to the point where she could not stand straight. Her lungs were failing from years of breathing contaminated air and water. She developed a chronic cough that brought up blood. She could not work anymore. The foreman told her not to come back. He hired a younger woman to take her place. Sarah had no savings, no pension, no way to support herself. Her husband's fishing income was not enough to cover the whole family. Her children, now older, started working in the same oyster beds where Sarah had destroyed herself. The cycle continued. Sarah stayed home, unable to do much more than sit and cough. She felt useless. She had worked herself into disability trying to keep her family alive, and now she was just a burden. She faded over the next 2 years, her body finally giving up after years of abuse. She died at 33 from pneumonia. Her lungs, damaged by years of cold water and shell dust, could not fight the infection. Society needed cheap oysters. Restaurants needed them. Markets needed them. Working families needed affordable protein. That demand was met by people like Sarah, who stood in freezing water and destroyed their bodies for pennies. Every oyster eaten in a comfortable restaurant represented hours of human suffering. Every basket sold at a market was filled with pain. Sarah made that possible. She sacrificed her health, her youth, and her life so others could eat affordably. And society gave her nothing in return except poverty, pain, and an early grave. The industry eventually changed. Mechanization reduced the need for hand shucking. Labor laws were passed, though enforcement was weak and slow. Conditions improved slightly, but those changes came too late for Sarah and thousands like her who were used up and discarded before protections existed. They paid the price of survival. They worked until their bodies broke so their families could eat one more day. Sarah is gone now. The tidal flats where she worked have been cleaned up or developed. The oyster company that employed her no longer exists, but the principle she lived by remains relevant. When survival depends entirely on work, when there is no safety net and no alternative, people will accept any conditions, endure any suffering, destroy any part of themselves to keep living. Sarah stood in cold water for 7 years. She ruined her hands, her back, and her lungs, and then the system replaced her and moved on as if she had never existed. If you think oyster shucking was the worst survival job in history, there were others. Jobs that demanded even more. Jobs that killed even faster. Jobs where the price of survival was measured in broken bodies and early graves. And some of those systems are still operating right now.